The Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle began in 1878 as an educational venture to provide learning for adults without access to college. It has become our nation's longest-running continuous book discussion group, and upwards of 100 people graduate from the program each year. Each class designs a banner, and each Thursday I'm going to choose one that I think is particularly wonderful to display for that week's book. Unfortunately, it looks like rain, and we don't let the banners travel when they might get wet. So I just want to tell you that the one I've chosen for today is the one from the class of 2015. Their slogan, "Creating Connections, Transforming Traditions," defines this year's book theme, which is community. This presentation today is underwritten by the Caroline Roberts Barnum and Julianne Barnum Follansbee Fund. Both Caroline and Julianne were deeply invested in Chautauqua and in the CLSC, and 8 generations of their family have been active at Chautauqua. So let's thank the Barnum Follansbee family for their support, as we thank all of your families who give to support the Chautauqua experience. Published last year, Sing for Your Life details Ryan Speedo Green's journey from solitary confinement to the opera stage. Mr. Bergner depicts what it takes to find and foster the beauty of the human voice while shedding unique light on the enduring and complex realities of race in America. Daniel Bergner is a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine, and he is the author of 6 books. He has received an Overseas Press Club Award for International Reporting and a Lettre Ulysses Award for the Art of Reportage. Mr. Bergner has contributed to The Atlantic and to Harper's. Sing for Your Life has been a New York Times bestseller and was named a New York Times and Washington Post notable book of this past year. So, ladies and gentlemen, concerned community members here and in your hometowns, opera lovers, self-reinventors, please join me in welcoming Daniel Bergner in his first visit to Chautauqua.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to everyone who helped put this together, and thank you to you all. It's an honor to be here, to be part of this tradition, to be leading off this series of writers, many of whom I revere. I'm going to start off by taking a small risk. Perhaps I shouldn't. I'd love to be invited back. If this risk backfires, it's not going to be good. But I'm going to suggest an exercise of the mind and heart, an exercise that, if I were sitting where you are, might make me wince. I might wince at the sentimentality. I might refuse to take part. But nevertheless, if you will, can we all just take a moment and picture a child or a grandchild of our own, or any child close to us at around the age of 12. And now I'm going to go farther in this ill-considered experiment. Can you please close your eyes and sit with that image of that child? I'm going to do it too, so if you're thinking this is way too touchy-feely and a scowl has crossed your face, I'm not going to know it. Okay. Ryan Speedo Green, the everything of this book that I'm here to talk about, grew up in southeastern Virginia in low-income housing in a trailer park and in a shack-like house across the street from drug dealers with bullet holes above his mother's bedroom window. Existence inside his homes was volatile and violent. Between his mother, his father for the few years that his father was around, his stepfather for the few years that that marriage lasted, his older brother, Ryan himself. And when he was 12 years old, Ryan threatened his mother's and brother's life, threatened those lives with a knife and with a vivid drawing of what he intended to do. In handcuffs and in leg shackles, he was driven in a police car across the state to near the West Virginia border to Virginia's juvenile institution of last resort. And there, he lashed out at staff and other kids. He was placed in isolation. Within days of his arrival, this was the scene. "I'm gonna kill you," he announced to a tall black girl who reminded him of his mother. "I'm gonna rip your fucking face off." He warned that he would do the same to staff. "You're doing this to me, you're the fucking reason," he told them. They pinned his arms behind his back. They shut him in one of the seclusion cells. The cinder block walls were off-white, the linoleum floor a watery blue. The cell throbbed, fast, loud pulses of sound from an air vent above. The rhythmic noise encased him, invaded him, vibrated inside his skull. "Why do they think you're so evil? Why are you so evil?" He gazed through a slit of glass in the door. It gave him only glimpses. Staff were smiling, a kid was smiling. He couldn't hear them, but knew they were laughing. He lay on his belly on the tiles. "Get me out of here," he howled into the gap at the base of the door. "Get me out of here." He stood, pounded on the door, pounding, pounding. "I'm gonna kill you, white bitch," he shrieked at a nurse. "Racist," he accused. "Hawaiian bitch. I am perfectly fucking calm. I want the fuck out. I promise I will kill each and every one of you." He screamed until his voice left him. 12 years later, in New York, when he was 24, I met a radiant human being. And here is Ryan Speedo Green on stage at the Metropolitan Opera in his first major role there, singing in La Boheme this past fall. This is near the end of the opera, near its climactic scene. For the characters, love and artistic dreams are dying. I know many of you are opera fans, but if you don't know the story, it doesn't matter. All that matters for this moment is Ryan's voice.
Vecchia zimarra, senti, io resto al pianto a scendere il sacro monte orbevi. Le mie grazie ricevi.
I'll relay that applause to Speedo, who I talk with fairly frequently. So the morning after opening night, the New York Times called his performance a showstopper. And here, through Speedo's story, and by the way, he very much prefers to be called Speedo, so I'm going to do that from here on. I'm going to talk about the layers, the possibilities that exist within us. Speedo's is a story about the invention, or the reinvention of self. It's a story about educators, about faith, about art, and about where we Americans are when it comes to race. Let's go back to Speedo as a child, before he was locked up, at the ages of 9 through 11. He was placed in this special classroom for the most out-of-control elementary schoolers in his entire school district. And his teacher there was Mrs. Hughes, a pint-sized Irish-Italian woman with a pile of blonde-tinted curls atop her head. On his first day, he threw his desk at her and told her, "I'm not going to learn from any white woman." He expected her to have him taken away. In fact, shortly before, when he was 8, for the safety of the other kids in his class, his teacher had cleared all the other students from the classroom and left Speedo alone inside it until he could be escorted out. But Mrs. Hughes surprised him. She did something else. She told him, "Since your desk is on the floor, you can learn from the floor until you're ready to do otherwise." You need to know something about Mrs. Hughes. She refused to be told about the records of the students who were being sent to her. Now, I know there are probably several, if not many, teachers in this room. I taught for years. My son's now teaching. And for those of you who've had that experience, you know that teachers tend to like to share not only their great moments, but also a bit of the moments of the students who torment them. And indeed, since she was now getting the least controllable kids in the district, there were teachers who'd really been through some trials with these kids and who were eager to share their experiences. She all but covered her ears when teachers tried to share their trials with the kids she was being given. In fact, if you visit her today, you'll see in her living room 3 monkey statuettes. You got it. They're hands over ears and eyes and mouth, representing the mantra, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. She had infinite, not naive, but infinite faith in recreation. She made her students memorize parts of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, and chose this not only in an attempt to mitigate the distance between her as a white woman and her students, who were mostly black, but also because of that phrase, content of their character. She hoped that phrase might imbue in her kids the lesson that they were in control, that in her class, they would not be judged by how they had been judged previously, but rather by what and who they now decided to be. She knew that all her students would not be able to transform themselves, maybe not even half her students, but Speedo thrived. He had a revelation. He could read, really read. He lost himself in the Narnia books, stayed up late reading them. Still, all hadn't changed. His rage flared, and after these episodes of fury, he wrote Mrs. Hughes letters. And for a journalist, one of the wonderful things about Mrs. Hughes is that she saves everything. An entire room in her house is devoted to her teaching memorabilia, hence all the letters. And I'm going to read you one. It has plenty of misspellings. I can't catalog them all. But you do need to know about one misspelling. So the second time he uses the word heart, H-E-A-R-T, he means hurt, H-U-R-T. Dear Mrs. Hughes, I made a great fool of myself. I admit I did yell at him. I haven't been starting the day right. Even though I am sitting in this seat, I am lessening. I will try to start over. I see how better everyone would be when I'm not here. People say life would be better without Ryan, and now I know they are telling the truth. You may think I am mean-hearted, but I'm not. I don't want to hurt anyone. I've always said I could work on it, but it just happens again. Thank you for not giving up on me, because it shows me I can do it if I try. Your student, Ryan. That line, I am sitting here lessening, still gets to me. By 12, Speedo was out of Mrs. Hughes's class, and at 12, being driven across the state in shackles and locked up. Mrs. Hughes found out where he was and called him at the facility. He listened to her reassurances for a minute or two, hung up, and sobbed. At the facility, most of the staff was worn down, and some seriously injured by the mix of criminal and psychiatric cases they were dealing with. Priscilla Jenkins was the Hawaiian bitch Speedo railed at. Actually, I would learn, she is Cuban and prided herself on the relentless Cuban hugs she gave out. With me, years later, Speedo would recall those hugs clearly, even if her ethnicity was a muddle. Regularly, even after his aggression toward her landed him in isolation, she found ways to give him a few extra points on his behavior chart so he could play this video game of flying this cartoonish propeller plane across this crystalline sky and landing it on this island landing pad. He would tell me, that was the lowest point of my life, but there was this one woman there at the center. I promised to find her. Speedo never forgot the faith that she had placed in him. Now, you'd be right to wonder, and I actually hope some of you are, how can this writer possibly know what life was like for Speedo while he was locked up at the age of 12? And, footnote for later, you might also rightly wonder, how can this white writer possibly know enough about Speedo's experience to render it in this book? That second question I hope we'll get to in the Q&A. Please don't hesitate to ask it. The answer about his life in the facility is, I got lucky. I found Priscilla Jenkins, I found other staff who'd worked there, I found kids who'd spent time there, and the facility kept an incredibly detailed log. Every 15 minutes were documented in notes. The current director was kind and helpful. Speedo put in a request, and one day he handed me a heavy box, 600 pages of material that had come in the mail, and said something to the effect of, here, you take it. I can't deal with reading this. The records raise the most profound and troubling questions. Am I still that person? Is that person still inside me? I should pause here, though, to explain how Speedo and I first met, how we began the 5 years that went into this book. So starting in 2010, for the New York Times Magazine, I was following the Metropolitan Opera's annual contest to find the most promising young singers in North America. And by email, about 2 weeks before the semifinals of the contest, I sent out a message to all the 22 semifinalists saying, here's what I'm doing, send me something about your lives, your connection to music, whatever you want to share. And I got back responses from everyone. Some of those responses were great length, totally understandable. These are young singers. This was a chance to get featured in the New York Times Magazine. I got responses from every one of those singers except one, not a word from Ryan Speedo Green. And during the singers' few days of kind of getting acclimated in New York, right before the semifinal event, many sought me out. It was easy for me to find the rest. Speedo made himself scarce. Difficult though it may be to believe, he did not think he had a story to tell. He also, and this has always been interesting to me, he had a different relationship to and different assumptions about the past than you or I might have. The relatively affluent, the therapeutically influenced among us may believe some version of unburying and understanding the past will help us in our present, in our future, will strengthen us, will liberate us, will improve us. But to Speedo, digging down into the past was a danger. It could suck you back. Better to leave it buried. So we got to know each other gradually, and gradually we traveled back into his history. And further back than that, on his mother's side of the family, and she and I spent days crisscrossing Virginia. His roots ran deep in that area of southeastern Virginia, where America's beginnings seemed to speak from the soil. The settlement of Jamestown, the embrace of slavery on the colony's tobacco plantations, the British surrender at Yorktown. In a country churchyard, on one trip I made alone, I found the gravestones of Speedo's family from a couple of generations back, except that they weren't gravestones. They were these little thin bits of metal, just picture license plates, staked into the ground. That was what the family could afford. Now, when he got out of the facility, Speedo wanted desperately never to go back there, to separate himself from where he'd been. He knew he needed to separate himself too from who he'd been. But how? Besides the faith offered him by Mrs. Hughes and Priscilla Jenkins, what did he have to go on? At that point, in the trailer park, things could have gone worse than nowhere. His stepbrother is now serving a third sentence for drug dealing, gun possession, gang activity. His full brother, a talented visual artist, has served time, and the last I visited him was living precariously on couches at the edge of the Mojave Desert. But for Speedo, luck and art and sheer will intervened. This is an intricate part of the story. But all that's important to know here is that as a young teenager, Speedo really was not a singer. I know that's hard to believe, hearing that voice, but he was not. He had no experience as a singer. We have to dispense with the stereotype. He did not sing gospel in church. But circumstances led him, or kind of forced him really, to do a perfunctory audition for a half-day School of the Arts in Norfolk, Virginia. He got through the Star-Spangled Banner. He got through it not particularly well. But two factors. One, the school's classical singing department needed a certain number of kids from his district, and that district did not typically churn out classical singers. And two, major factor, Mrs. Hughes' husband was a school administrator and happened to have become the principal of this School of the Arts. Now, you've got to picture Mr. Hughes, because like his wife, he has gold-dyed curls. And somehow to me, that is wonderfully fitting. The Hughes are like these fairy tale figures with these curly golden heads. And he placed his delicate finger on the admission scales. Speedo could not read music. Ear training for him, I think, was like an exercise in trying to hear a dog whistle. He could no more identify a note played by his teacher on the piano than a human being can register the special sounds that dogs obey. Was that a G, an A, an E natural? And what did it mean for a note to be natural? And meanwhile, at home, when things got volatile, his mother's boyfriend was disciplining him with stomach punches. He was about to be kicked out of the arts program at the end of his first year. But if Speedo were here today, he would want you to remember, above all, two names, two teachers, Mrs. Hughes and Mr. Brown. He would want us to pay tribute to all that teachers can mean for a child. I dedicated this book to my children, who in many ways saved me, but had it been Speedo's page to dedicate, he would have named Mrs. Hughes and Mr. Brown, who saved him. Mr. Brown was a towering African-American voice teacher at the School of the Arts, taller than Speedo, who was on his way to the 6'5" and 300 pounds that he stands today. And Mr. Brown refused to let Speedo fail, insisted on tutoring him, on driving him the 45 minutes home to the trailer park after their late sessions in the studio together, and then, of course, for Mr. Brown, 45 minutes back, on buying him clothes, on buying him dinner, on mediating whenever things got rough at home. Mr. Brown became a father figure to Speedo because Speedo saw his father only a handful of times as he grew up. And then Mr. Brown took a group of his students on a trip to New York to see Carmen at the Met. It was Speedo's first opera. That night, at this grand opera house that many of you know, the Chagall murals, the chandeliers, the curved staircases, the crimson carpeting, the lead role was sung by an African-American mezzo-soprano, Denise Graves. And Speedo, who had always associated opera with, as he tells it, a cartoon of this big fat white lady screeching and shattering glass in a Viking helmet, Speedo was smitten by Graves, who was not only a beautiful singer, but beautiful, and smitten by the music. Mr. Brown happened to know Denise Graves, and he took his students backstage, and she singled out Speedo and hugged him. And at the end of the evening, as the students crossed the plaza and as they passed that glorious fountain shooting high, elegant plumes of water, he told Mr. Brown, "I'm going to sing at the Met." Mr. Brown laughed, as many of you just have. And there's so much to tell about the devotion and the will that take a person, took Speedo, from that declaration to where he is now. For the sake of time, I have to leave those scenes of artistic determination for the book, or maybe for your questions. So in a way, there's this irony to this talk, that it's all about reinventing the self, and it leaves out an essential, demanding part of that transformation. But I do want to say that one of the things that drew me to this subject was the chance to find a language in my impure art writing that might capture his very pure art music. And I think you know what I mean by that impurity and purity, but of course, you know, the chains of writing are that I have to work through all that's up here, through the intellect, to get to the heart and to the body, whereas a great singer, and particularly an opera singer, is working without amplification. I mean, his voice is entering you physically and directly, and that emotional connection is extremely powerful and enviable to me. So that was something that attracted me. And then to drop down a level into detail was also entrancing to learn about the architecture, this natural amphitheater that exists inside our heads, behind our faces, behind what opera singers call the mask. And it literally is sort of these parallel structures of resonance, which singers have to learn to manipulate. I mean, this thing going vertically is quite crude. It's just a lot of, in Speedo's case, a very powerful lot of air going up through two flaps of mucous membrane, the vocal cords. It's not doing anything but being noisy. And it's all this and the control of it that takes that power and projects it outward, still powerfully, because, as you know, no amplification in an opera house, but full of nuance and beauty. These are really involuntary muscles and thus out of reach of our control. And yet, you know, as I sat in studio after studio with some of the best teachers in the world, one of whom I'm happy to say is on the campus today. I ran into him yesterday, Brian Ziegler. You know, working with him, working with a couple of others at the Met was like, you know, me calling Matisse and saying, can you teach me about color? I mean, and amazingly, these musicians said yes. And so I was just taken from scratch to knowledge by these just great sensibilities, great artistic sensibilities. But, you know, what they explained was, for singers, just imaging a shape can affect, just microscopically, the relationship between these spaces, and thus can create what you hear as the beauty of Speedo's voice. So that was all part of the thrill for me and the thrall of working on this book. And then I should say also, it was wonderful to learn little things that just made the stakes even higher for someone like Speedo. Number one, to enter into this profession as a bass baritone was to not know till later just how big your voice and how rich your voice was going to get. Sopranos tend to know relatively early, basses, bass, baritones, not until later on. Also, just that projection, even more is at stake for a bass or bass baritone. It's hard to explain quickly, but that orchestra is so strong and more easily swallows up a low voice than a high voice. So much to learn for Speedo, and it was just a great privilege to get to learn alongside him. Now, when Speedo and I first met before the semifinals, he was perhaps 1/3 of the way along this journey to true artistry. He had made it through middling conservatories. The other semifinalists had gone to places like Juilliard and the Academy of Vocal Arts. He was scratching out a living by touring around Colorado mountain towns and singing in abridged operas in schools and community centers. And when I didn't get an email from Speedo in those 2 weeks before the semis, I didn't think anything of it because no one at the Met had mentioned him as a likely winner. His craft was crude. He sang everything forte, even when Verdi and Mozart specified the softness of pianissimo. His legato was a mess. He was crippled by technical flaws. But certain things were driving him. Just before the semis, he managed to reach his father by phone in Bakersfield, California. He tried to explain to his father how big a deal the contest was, and his father promised that if Speedo made it to the finals, he would somehow get himself across the country to New York to hear him sing opera for the first time. I want to give you just a hint of what this promise meant to Speedo from these few paragraphs, and all you really need to know is that Adrian is Speedo's older brother, that their father was at one time an amateur bodybuilder, and that he claimed to have once met Arnold Schwarzenegger. Ryan couldn't tell Adrian about the contest because at that point he didn't know how to reach him. His brother had been released from prison not long ago. He was living on the streets, or at best on couches, somewhere in California, probably. He had a 7-year-old son he hadn't seen in several years, not only because he'd spent 2 of those years locked away, but because his ex-wife had a restraining order against him. Ryan and Adrian had exchanged vows when they were kids, vows spoken after Ryan burrowed into his brother's chest while the chaos of their mother's second marriage consumed the flimsy walls and floors, traveling through the house to swallow them. Vows, Ryan said, that we would never be like that, and that when we grew up, we would never hit a woman. At birthdays and Christmases, they made another set of pledges to each other. We swore we wouldn't forget about our children. They had made a habit as kids of teaming up to steal action figurines from a discount store. One of them stood watch in the aisle, while the other took from the shelves. They collected the pliable superheroes, hyper-muscled and heavily armed with rocket launchers and mega machine guns. They took Schwarzenegger more than once, took him in several of his roles, carried his spectacular body and bravery home, knowing that their father had once shaken his hand, knowing that their father loved him. They stole him again and again, like stealing their father back into their lives, and kept him in their bedroom. Something else was driving Ryan Speedo Green, the singer: the transcendence of race. This drive had its source in King's speech, memorized in Mrs. Hughes's classroom. He wanted to be, as he told me, a small part of King's dream. Singing opera was not, for Speedo, a denial of being African American. Far from it. Speedo is proudly, fiercely African American. Yet he wanted to be heard. He wanted the beauty and power of his singing to make race immaterial. Like the other parts of Speedo's story, this part is about reinvention. The reinvention that we will all have to find our way toward as a country, all of us, no matter our politics and no matter our color. Speedo's is not a Jackie Robinson story. The Met stage was integrated by Marian Anderson in the 1950s. Speedo's is a complicated story fitting for our complicated times. It is about redefining identity, recasting how we perceive each other, and redrawing the boundaries of possibility. When Speedo first embraced opera in high school, his classmates on the morning bus, and remember, he was going to his regular school for half a day and then to the art school. His classmates on the morning bus snatched his musical scores from his hands and mocked him for singing white people's music. Meanwhile, from back then, right up till now, after hearing him in operas or in classical recitals, white audience members often crowd around him and beg him to sing Old Man River, like Paul Robeson in Showboat. Old Man River is an anthem of resignation sung by a physically strong but oppressed and pitiable black character in the Jim Crow South, and it's sung typically in heavy black dialect. It is, Speedo would say, I would say, you all know, a beautiful piece of music, but it has little to do with Speedo's musical dreams. So I'll close with this bit of a scene. At a party thrown by a wealthy Met patron, this is just as Speedo's career was just getting going. Maybe he's really, in fairness, only just at the beginning edge of a career at this point. He's at this party in this lovely Manhattan apartment, and just picture centuries-old tapestries high on the walls of this vaulted ceiling, and picture Speedo somewhat isolated, standing by the piano. The pianist suggested Old Man River, proposed it heartily, his voice ringing out. The hostess and host and their guests, a celebrated Met tenor among them, formed a white chorus. Yes, Old Man River, sing Old Man River. He was surely alone at that moment. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to be heard. And here he was in a room packed with well-meaning people who did not see him, who perhaps were incapable of seeing him, who possibly refused to see him, and who were eager to have him inhabit an object of pity, to hear him be that pitiable object with every note that rose from behind his ribs and from within his throat, to gather around the big, brawny black man and listen to him lament his oppressed and thwarted and minuscule life. I am the epitome, he told me in the months before that party, of don't judge a book by its cover. Everything I did when I was younger, everything I was around, everything I was, gave you only a cover to look at. I was another number, a statistic. I was a stereotype, another kid going worse than nowhere. And I was only seeing the cover. A few people were trying to read the book, and then I started to read it and started to create new chapters in it. But earlier, the cover was what I was looking at. And here, beneath the tapestries, he was surrounded by people who longed to have him shrink back behind a cover. Not the same cover, but a similar one. And the threat he felt was not only in how they would see and hear him, but in how he would see and hear himself, in what he would sacrifice, in what he would betray of his ambition and accomplishment as he sang each note. He would feel reduced, confined, simplified, compressed, concealed. While a crucial part of what he aimed for as an artist was an expansion, a wrestling against assumption, a defying of definitions, a tenacious embrace of complication when it came to being African American. Thank you. Thanks. All right, well, I would love to take your questions. If Speedo were here, he would love it too. It's our favorite part. So,
I don't know if this is too personal, but is he still married to his wife? And did they ever have children? I can't remember.
So this is all
That's
fairly...
part of the story, too.
Yeah, this is all fairly recent, remember. So, yes, and I think it's okay to say, because she's far enough along, yes, they're expecting. I've got the sonogram photos on my phone. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I enjoyed your talk, and
Thank you.
very much enjoyed your book. And perhaps some are not aware, but every week preceding the author's visit, we have a book review and then a book discussion, which occurred last Monday. During the discussion, it was brought up because he had a lot of Lucky Breaks, Brown, Hughes, et cetera, all these teachers at the Met that just worked hard. And some of us, I being one, concluded that this young man would have made it anywhere as a teacher, as a sales rep, someplace with his personality and his, as a counselor. And some agreed with me and some didn't. And of course, you know him a lot better than anybody else in the room.
Right.
What's your response to that? I'd like to give the guy a hug and hang out with him.
And if you gave him a hug, he would equally wrap you up in a hug as he does me. He loves to call me tiny, and I keep saying, Speed, I'm pretty normal size. It's you who's the 6'5" and 300. But, you know, if I knew the answer to that, the book wouldn't have been worth writing, right? Only unanswerable questions make for worthwhile books, and I think that is an unanswerable question. Look, he has a tremendous amount of sheer will, and if he was here today, what you would see, I think I used this word when I was speaking, a radiant human being. Right? You would not see a person who visibly reflects that 12-year-old. But would he have made it anyway? I don't think he would be sure about that. I think I can fairly represent him in saying, you know, without Mrs. Hughes, without Mr. Brown, and difficult though the relationship was, volatile and violent, there's a certain amount of resilience that his mother imbued in him. So without those factors and others, and then let's not forget at the Met. So let's not forget the sort of the end game here. You know, people really, so, you know, when the Met was deciding whether to work with him, there was a lot of debate. Really, those technical flaws cannot be overstated. And again, there was this tremendous series of gestures of faith. So I'm sorry I can't render a verdict and settle the debate. I don't think we should settle it. I think we need to sit here and with uncertainty, with awe at the will and the talent, but also with awe at the trust that those teachers invested in him, the sense of trust. Like, to go back to Priscilla Jenkins for a sec, I think the way he would explain that dynamic in the facility was that he was continually doing horrible things, and he would always get his behavior points wiped out, which meant he got to do absolutely nothing. But what she would do in cheating a little and giving him back a few points was it wasn't just that she put him back on that, you know, controls of that propeller plane video game. It was that she was saying to him, I believe in you. And that in turn instilled in him a sense of, not only a possibility, but he would say a sense of shame, so that in failing her the next time, he was feeling his own failure more deeply and was trying all the more hard to transcend that. And when he and I went back, and we've been back a number of times to the center, and the first time was this reunion between Priscilla and Speedo. That was a powerful moment of him seeing someone he was really felt indebted to. Yeah.
His life now.
So I don't know how much to give away. I want people to read this book, and so does Speedo badly. You know, we always ran into this problem on interviews, and he would say to me even more, I mean, he was kind of my best representative. It should have been me, the writer, who was worried about this, and he would say, no, I want people to like really experience this. It was really flattering to me that, you know, he felt I'd captured his life really, really well. So, did his father come? I don't know, should we leave that one open? Let's leave that one open. Read the book, and there is a lot of story involving his father that ensues from that phone call to Bakersfield. Yeah.
On his relationship with his mother, you said that she built resilience into him. I think the book also makes clear she built a penchant for anger and violence. And there's a kind of a transmigration from darkness to light in that relationship between the two through the book. Where does it end up with some distance now behind him? And the other one, I didn't hear the last question, but when he is informed at his father's funeral by his half-brother that Dad never thought you were his son, I wonder, how does that, did that ever get resolved?
Right, so we're deep into the spoiler alerts. Okay, so relationship with his mother. I think Speedo, look, it's complicated, as all our relationships with our mothers are. It's particularly complicated and fraught because it was a violent relationship when Speedo was young. I know what he would say. He would say it's a work in progress. It's not easy. But, you know, I've spoken to her since she came to Bohème. She's really proud. But it's not easy. Just multiply each of our own uneasinesses with our mothers and many times, and you'll feel that. It is a work in progress for him. Again, I think I'm going to leave the father story alone because it's so complicated and so emotional for Speedo, except to say this. One of the magical connections that Speedo made, whatever the genetic truths are, is that, you know, Speedo's father was a tremendous showman. And I should say, he was an amateur bodybuilder. He was only 5'7", so 6'5", 5'7". But he lit up a room. And Speedo, learning about this late in the story, really connects with it and feeds off it. And one of Speedo's great talents, I hope you all get a chance to see this at some point as opera fans, is as a comedic actor and a comedic singer in a part like Basilio. I mean, he's just over the top. He's just owns that stage, and his voice rises to that comedy. So he really constantly feels himself channeling his father's spirit. Okay.
I loved your book, and one of the things that I really loved about it was how important it was to Speedo to go back to the juvenile detention center, and I wondered if you could speak to that a little.
Yeah, so I went back just as a reporter, and then the director asked if I would see if Speedo would come, and he eagerly agreed. So we flew down and drove across, and we went out to breakfast beforehand. And Speedo was slated. First, we went back day one just so Speedo could tour through and see his old cell and really just absorb it, and I suppose in some ways be inoculated to the power of that, because the next day we went back, and he sang for and spoke to a group of the kids who were locked up there. And then for the kids whose behavior problems were too intense and they hadn't been allowed onto the main, reception, he went back to their locked units to talk to them. And anyway, before we did all that, we went to breakfast, and he took my hands and prayed that he could reach just one of those kids. Let me reach just one of these kids. And to watch him reach out relentlessly on that day, very much not always successfully, some of these kids were not reachable. But finally, to hear this one girl who was locked up there try to, fail to, and then finally succeed in singing to him was, and still, makes me choke up. So yeah, we've been back since. I'm sure we'll be back again. That is crucial to him, is making his embrace and his experience stand for something for other kids like him.
Hi.
Yeah, hi.
So I've noticed that an underlining theme in the book is this idea of I don't belong, and especially I don't belong because of race. But in my experience as a person of color trying to get in a career in the arts, the idea of self-doubt is not I don't belong, but maybe they want me because of race. Maybe I'm a diversity hire. And I wonder if that's an idea that you came across in your research, or if you thought you should include it, or why you shouldn't include it in the book.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. And it's interesting. I would have anticipated that being a bigger issue in Speedo's artistic life than, in fact, it was. And here's why I think it wasn't much of an issue. You know, there, and you may know this already, I don't know, are you a singer or an actress or, okay. Okay. So in the opera world, I think this is fair to say, is the most, or maybe one of the two most, exacting artistic vocations that I know. To watch the opera cognoscenti, or to watch opera classical voice coaches at work, is to see an exactitude, a standard that simply will not bend. And so, although one might have expected, oh, Speedo, you know, not only is he African American, but we've read Daniel's story in the New York Times Magazine, which had already run at one point, and he's had this hard upbringing, let's give Speedo a break. No, that just didn't happen. I mean, he was barely moved along, you'll see from the book, from phase to phase. There just, to put it bluntly, there just wasn't affirmative action at work here at all. I mean, if anything, I think, you know, according to people inside the Met, there was even an added distrust, like, oh, this very large black man. Is he gonna sound too raspy, too throaty, too gospel-y? Is his diction gonna be good enough? Is his, you know, language gonna be okay? No. I grant you, this may have been a unique case. And I think what you're talking about, I should give you the microphone and you should take over, because I think it's a huge question. But for Speedo, no, I think he's really risen despite the way we see and how the way we see affects the way we hear, rather than because of the way we see. And again, I thank you very much for that question. I thank you all.